Oh no. Oh, where are we going? Oh no. We're coming back around. Oh no. Okay, we stopped. Well, hello, all of my skeleton army compatriots, and welcome to my abode. I've brought you all here tonight to experience the ghastly, true stories of someone less pretentious than this, I hope. Because, wow, that was awful. So, today we're here to talk about the most prolific team of paranormal investigators to ever do it. The demon-hunting power couple of Ed and Lorraine Warren. As you probably know by now, Lorraine was a powerful medium, and Ed was one of the only people in the country at the time qualified as a demonologist. So, throughout their time on the road, the Warrens reported having conducted over 10,000 supernatural investigations. Many of those encounters were recorded and transposed into best-selling books and blockbuster hits. So, throughout this video, we're going to take a critical look at some of these prolific cases. Disclaimer: these cases describe brutal acts of violence being committed against the victims. Also, I am a godless atheist who is agnostic at best regarding the existence of the paranormal. So if that instantly discredits me in your eyes, that's fine. This video is more for those with an open mind and a willingness to check their own biases. But without further ado, let's get spooky. The Amityville Horror. In the middle of the night, roughly 3:15 a.m., November 13th, 1974, Ronald DeFeo murdered his entire family with a .35 caliber Marlin 336 rifle at their home at 112 Ocean Avenue, New York. Investigators reported that all 6 bodies were found in the same position, face down with a bullet in the back, and no signs of struggle. No gunshots were reported, and no dogs were barking that night. DeFeo was initially brought into the station for his own protection because the police believed the case to be a mob shooting. However, after noticing discrepancies in DeFeo's story, he was charged. When the case went to trial, he admitted to all 6 counts of murder, but claimed that there was a voice inside of his head telling him to kill his family. The jury didn't agree. He was found guilty of 6 counts of second-degree murder, receiving 6 25 to life sentences. This is when the house gained its reputation as being haunted. Despite this grisly scene, our story doesn't begin until a new family moves into the house. In December 1975, the Lutz family bought the old DeFeo house. Despite being informed that a family was murdered inside the house, its massive size and location made the $80,000 they paid for it a steal. They moved in immediately and moved out almost as immediately. After spending only 28 days inside the home, the Lutz family vacated it. They claimed that many ghostly things happened, from George, the father of the Lutzes, waking up every night at 3:15 a.m., supposedly the same time that Ronald DeFeo committed these murders, to demonic hoof prints appearing in the snow. They even reported that the walls would ooze green slime.
The walls will ooze green slime! Oh, wait, they always do that.
Apparently, not even the blessings of a priest could stop these demonic entities from harming the Lutz family, as they had a priest bless the house the very day they moved in. The priest claimed to have felt a slap on his face that day, despite him being the only one in the home. 1 year after the Lutz family moved out of the house, Ed and Lorraine Warren did an overnight investigation with Channel 5 New York and reporter Michael Linder. They took time-lapse photographs of the house's stairwell that seemed to show a childlike apparition in one of the rooms at the top of the stairwell. The Lutz family claimed that the child in that photo is none other than John DeFeo, one of the young children who was murdered in the house. The Warrens declared the house haunted, and the Lutzes never moved back in. So what's wrong with this story? So, the reason we're starting with Amityville is because, first, it's the one that blew Ed and Lorraine Warren sky high. That was the one that jumped them into superstar. Secondly, it's the one that has the most conflicting evidence. So to begin with, a common thing we're going to see as we go forward is that the families are always in financial trouble. It's consistent. It never misses. It is a complete hit every time. So next, investigator Rick Moran, no, not the Spaceballs guy. That's Rick Moranis.
I knew it. I'm surrounded by assholes.
So Rick Moran reported over 100 different discrepancies between the alleged story and the reported facts of the case. The best example is that the Lutzes gave an exact date for the night they found all of the hoof prints in the snow. But that couldn't have happened because there was no snow on the ground that day anywhere. So it's kind of hard to picture demonic footprints in the snow when the snow doesn't exist. I mean, like, unless the ghosts made the snow for the demon to walk through. I guess I never thought of that, So next, and most disturbingly, we'll say, is this picture right here of the kid at the top of the stairwell, right? So that looks pretty conclusive, right? That looks like little Johnny DeFeo. Cannot argue with that. Except the issue is that Ed and Lorraine Warren's manager, Paul Bartz, no, not the mall cop, that's Paul Blart. Paul Bartz was there that night with them working the case, right? And if you were to take a picture of Paul Bartz and put it right next to that photo, kind of looks more like him. I mean, you can see it. Look at the part, look at the shirt. I think that's pretty conclusive. Most damningly for this case, however, is Ron DeFeo's lawyer, Ron DeFeo being the guy that killed everyone, admitted to making the entire thing up with George Lutz over a bottle of wine. He straight up said they made the whole thing up so they could make a book out of it and make some money on it. The whole thing was fabricated. So they admitted to faking it. All of the instances seem to be easily disproven. The photographs that are taken are clearly just a manager instead of a haunted baby. So again, I think this is the easiest, most conclusive one. So on to the next. The Conjuring 2. In 1977, Enfield, London, single mother of 4, Peggy Hodgson is doing her best to raise her children upright. One night, after putting her 11 and 12-year-old daughters down for bed, she heard racket from their room. When she went up to tell them to go to sleep, she instead found the two seemingly already fast asleep. Peggy said she saw dresser drawers moving by themselves and immediately ran next door to her neighbors, the Nottinghams. When the Nottinghams arrived, they also reported hearing strange noises. They all agreed it was best to contact the police. When the police arrived on site, they thoroughly investigated, and while one officer did witness a chair flying across the room, they concluded that this was not an issue for the police to resolve. The Hodgsons then contacted a local publication called the Daily Mirror to investigate, and after nearly 3 hours of silence, the investigators decided it was time to leave. But it was right then, as they were ready to leave, that a Lego flew up and hit the photographer in the eye. The next 18 months involved a rotating cast of demonologists, spiritualists, and mediums, as well as the odd skeptic investigating the home for themselves. Reported instances of demonic activity during this time included, but are not limited to, silverware being bent by itself, the girls levitating above their bed, the whole family hearing strange noises at all hours, furniture falling over, and even fires being spontaneously lit. The coup de grace, however, was a demonic entity known as Bill possessing Janet and speaking through her in his own voice. They later found out that Bill was most likely Bill Wilkins, the previous owner of the home the Hodgsons were living in. Bill recalled the experience of dying of a hemorrhage in his living room through Janet's mouth, which is exactly how Bill Wilkins died. Ed Warren apparently even captured a full conversation between himself and 5 different ghostly apparitions that haunted the Hodgsons, the tapes of which are so harrowing that they have not yet been released to the public. Then, 18 months after the first incident, the mysterious happenings just stopped. The Hodgsons went back to normal, at least as normal as you can be after something like that. So what's wrong with this story? So, Hodgson was a single mother of 4 kids, and coming from a mother who was a single mother of 4, I can tell you that's not a very financially stable situation. So, again, family wasn't financially stable. That's going to be a running gag throughout this whole experience. But moving into the specifics of this particular instance, the girls had admitted to making up at least some of the instances. In fact, some of the instances they had not yet admitted to making up, they got caught doing. Like, for example, they were caught bending spoons so that that silverware would look like it was bent by ghosts when really it was them doing it. It also caught them trying to bend iron bars that were in the house, which is probably the part we should talk about. I think iron bars being inside of a home in the 70s is like, that's much scarier to me than ghosts. So the girls admitted to making stuff up, just outright, just fabricating things, but they still say that some of it was real. The issue is that then that kind of calls into question the credibility of what is and isn't real. So we kind of have to take everything with a pretty fine grain of salt. So the next piece that I want to bring up is that the fires and the voices, they weren't happening until someone mentioned them when talking about their previous investigations. So with all of these investigators rotating in and out, the girls got to speak with a lot of different people, talking about a lot of different instances, and with that, they learned a lot of different things they could potentially pull off to make people believe. If you look at the reported instances, you can see that there are certain things that just didn't happen until after investigators had brought it up. The next and most interesting piece, in my opinion, of evidence against the Hodgson's haunting is the Bill voice. So one of the things that needs to be addressed is Janet's knowledge of Bill Wilkins being dead. One of 2 things happened, right? And maybe I'm the idiot here, but I'm going to go with Occam's razor for this one. 1, an 11-year-old kid that lives in a house finds out from their neighbors that someone died in the living room of the house. Option 2, a demonic entity that happens to be the previous owner of the house possesses that girl and has her talk about the death. So those are the 2. Now again, I'm going to use Occam's razor and pick which one seems more parsimonious. But to take it a step further and to kind of reinforce this idea of me using Occam's razor here, I'm going to talk about the biggest nail in the coffin, and that is, amongst all the investigators that came to the home, a child psychologist came into the home as well. Someone really interested in the idea of someone potentially being possessed. And what they decided to do was check the vocabulary and phraseology differences between Bill and Janet. If Bill was possessing Janet, you would see words that you wouldn't expect Janet to know or use, and you'd hear ways of talking that people wouldn't expect out of a young girl. So this investigation conducted on her phraseology and vocabulary turned out that Bill had the exact phraseology and vocabulary as 11-year-old girl Janet. So I don't know about you, but I personally don't think that it works that demons only have access to the words that the person they're possessing knows. It kind of goes against all conventions with how demons work, at least that I've learned about. So the last one I want to leave you guys with is pretty self-explanatory. I'm just going to leave with you the reported photographs of the Hodgson kids levitating above their bed. Yeah. You tell me. The Haunted. After a flood destroyed their home in Wilkes-Barre, PA in 1974, Jack and Janet Smurl and their 4 children were forced to move into a duplex on Chase Street in West Pittston. The new home was in quite a bit of disrepair, but nothing the family thought they couldn't handle. At first, the home seemed to be a good move for the family, but not long after the family moved in, strange things began to happen. Initially, the episodes were benign. Tools went missing, then reappeared. Old wall stains would seep through fresh coats of paint. The stove even caught fire once. However, these small occurrences were just about through. The family reported that their house would randomly be filled with the stench of rotting flesh, and that they would be woken up by blood-curdling screams. Things continued to escalate like this until they reached a fever pitch, with instances like the family dog being thrown across the room and Jack being raped by a succubus. A chandelier had even fallen and cut one of the Smurl children. It was at this point the family decided to call the Warrens. In January of 1986, the Warrens investigated the strange occurrences at the Smurl residence. Their investigation confirmed that the Smurls were in fact being haunted by 4 distinct entities. A harmless elderly woman, a young and possibly violent girl, a man who suffered and died in the home, and a demon that was using the other 3 entities to attack the Smurl family. After witnessing the events at the house and confirming the existence of these spirits, the Warrens reached out to a local priest to help them perform 2 separate exorcisms. According to the family, things began to calm down after the last exorcism, but the family moved back to Wilkes-Barre in 1988 for good measure. So, what's wrong with this story? So, the family was in financial trouble. I can't continue to express how consistent a problem this is with all of these things, like, every time. It is a problem that will never go away. Piggybacking on the fact that the Smurl family was financially insecure, in 1986, the Warrens showed up and started investigating, and in 1986, the book deal was announced. Call it a coincidence. As we go through these, I'm looking for what events are definitively provable. What do we have legitimate evidence for, right? And in this case, the only thing we have legitimate evidence for is the chandelier falling and crashing to the ground and cutting one of the children. So, again, Let's hit that Occam's razor up. You move into a home that is in distinct disrepair and it has a chandelier. I'm going to tell you, I have lived in many homes that are in disrepair, all right? Lots of fixer-uppers in my past, and not one of them looked solid enough that it could handle a chandelier. So another provable instance that wasn't necessarily mentioned in the story is that Miss Janet Smurl apparently had contacted the police over and over and over and over again. But there is no report from the police anywhere that they were called by Janet Smurl in the entire time that she lived there. Again, this could be bad police records. I'm not going to rule out the fact that maybe the police in West Pittston are like the worst police ever. That's potentially true, okay? You never know. But it seems more likely to me that someone with a story to tell would mention the fact that the police didn't believe them. The police won't help us, only the demonologist will. So, another provable occurrence we could talk about is if skeptics investigated the house, right? We always see these big investigations done by Ed and Lorraine, but how often do we get to see the inverse, when someone who doesn't necessarily buy the story outright goes in to see whether or not it adds up? In this particular instance, there actually is a pretty startling issue. And that's that no one was allowed in the house to investigate unless Ed and Lorraine Warren specifically screened them ahead of time. In fact, the Committee for Scientific Investigation of Claims of the Paranormal contacted the Smurl family on multiple occasions and were initially granted access, but later called back and told, actually, you can't. There was one person that got in before the Warrens happened to put this no-fly zone in this house, and that is local newspaper reporter Joseph X. Flannery. And while Joseph was there, nothing happened the entire time he was reporting on this instance. And he was told specifically that, quote, when someone comes to visit the house to check on the presence of the spirits that doesn't believe it, nothing happens. They said that, quote, experts on the occult explained to them that demons and the spirits of the deceased will avoid manifesting themselves when such investigators are present. So, built-in excuse, no skeptics have ever been in except for one, Joseph Flannery, who found nothing the whole time he was there. The only provable instances are provably false or more parsimonious for natural occurrences. So again, I'm not here to rain on anyone's parade, but it seems like the best solution is that someone who is in financial trouble came up with a good story to sell to someone so that they could make a little money. It seems straightforward to me. In 1986, Carmen and Alan Snedeker moved into the small town of Southington, Connecticut, trying to live closer to the hospital at which their oldest son, Philip, was being treated for Hodgkin's lymphoma. Having fallen on hard financial times due to the expensive treatments for their son, they jumped at the chance to rent what appeared to be the perfect house. It was large enough for them, their 3 kids, and their young niece. And the rent was incredibly low for the size. But while the family moved in, they made a startling discovery. In the basement was a strange and unsettling room that was furnished with embalming tables and tools. After further investigation, they found out that the house used to be the Hallahan Funeral Home. Worse than that, the basement with the embalming tools was the only place in the house big enough for the 2 boys. Always, things began to get horrifying from this point forward. Al and Carmen reported strange phenomena like items disappearing, or children hearing strange noises and seeing strange people in their house, and even once, the sound of hundreds of birds in flight. Philip began to exhibit radical personality shifts, culminating in him supposedly trying to rape his young cousin Tammy. His family had him arrested and taken in for an evaluation, where he was diagnosed as schizophrenic. He was then held for 45 days in a mental health facility. During his time in the institution, his mental health seemed to have stabilized, but apparently had worsened once he had returned home. Other phenomena the Snedekers experience include mop water turning into blood, the smell of rotting flesh permeating throughout the house, and even the repeated and brutal rape of Carmen and her niece, as well as acts of sodomy being performed on Alan. Eventually, the Warrens were called in. Ed and Lorraine spent several weeks in the house alongside a small crew of other investigators who reported being physically assaulted by apparitions. The Warrens also claimed that one of the undertakers that worked in the house when it was a funeral parlor performed acts of necrophilia on the bodies they were embalming. The Warrens did a full-scale exorcism on the house and deemed it free of demonic forces. So what's wrong with this one? Say it with me. The Snedekers were in... That's right, financial trouble. How could you guess? I'm proud of you. You're paying attention. To begin with, again, we always like to start with claims that are easily verifiable, right? Things that we can look at and go, yeah, that happened, or no, that didn't happen. So, according to the Snedekers, they moved into the house and were totally blindsided by the fact that it used to be a funeral parlor. So, how true is that? Can you guess? It's not very true. According to the property owner that rented them the property, they said outright at the time they signed the lease that, yeah, it used to be a funeral home, which is why rent was as cheap as it was. What reason would they have to rent a house out so cheap if there wasn't something wrong with it? The claims that Lorraine Warren made about the undertakers, for whatever reason she decided to, they were never proven. There's no record of them anywhere, like anywhere on the planet. There is zero record of it having ever happened. So I don't know where she came up with that. I guess just a pretty solid imagination. Then we get to something that, again, is totally provable, which is that Philip, the kid with Hodgkin's lymphoma, started having these drastic personality shifts after going into the house. And that one's pretty straightforward. It's provable. He did have dramatic personality shifts, and he did try to sexually assault his cousin. So I guess that's a pretty interesting check mark. But what's interesting is why, right? So we can say something happened, but again, we're looking not just for that it happened, but what caused it. And in this case, 6 to 8% of people that are experiencing advanced forms of cancer and are receiving chemotherapy treatment for it can begin to hallucinate and exhibit radical personality shifts, which... He had Hodgkin's lymphoma, was receiving therapy for it, and experienced something that 6 to 8% of people experience. Moving on to the next one. Assuming this is all true, pretend with me, if you will, that you believe every sentence the Snedekers have uttered. Why the hell would you have stayed in a house where you, your husband or wife, right, you, your spouse, and your niece are being raped by apparitions consistently for 2 years? Why would you do that? If I moved into a home and I was being raped consistently by literally anything, I would be out of there as quick as I could at any cost possible. I'm not gonna live in a house where me, my wife, and my niece are being raped. That's not gonna happen. So strange that the Snedekers were just like, well, whatever. So, aside from everything we've spoken about so far, there are a couple more little nails we can put in the coffin here. One is that the property owner happened to live in a facility that was right next to that home and was also part of the funeral property during the same time the Snedekers were there. and reported no negative circumstances from anyone. Nothing weird ever happened to him, ever. But to take it a step further, no one before or after that had ever rented that house, and the people that live there now have been there for 10 years, have ever experienced anything. No one other than the Snedekers. They are the only people that have experienced anything in that house. The last one is that throughout the time that Ed and Lorraine Warren were doing these stories, they would never charge anyone for anything, right? They would come in and they would just do their investigation. However, they would always get the rights to the story and publish a book about it afterwards. But Ed and Lorraine Warren aren't really very good authors, so they would hire ghostwriters, people that had written usually science fiction or horror novels in the past, to write these books for them based on what they told them. So, the author for this particular situation with the Snedekers was Ray Garton. And according to Ray Garton, he doesn't believe any of it happened. And the reason that he doesn't believe any of this is real is because of something Ed Warren told him personally. And I'm going to read it out as it is. Quote, "He told me not to worry, that the family was crazy. All people who come to us are crazy. You think sane people would come to us? He knew I had written a lot of horror novels prior to that, so he told me to just make the story up using whatever details I could incorporate and make it scary." So yeah, everything that we've talked about is reasonably proven wrong, other than first-hand accounts that have never been corroborated by anyone other than self-interested people. So aside from that, the only statement we have is saying that it is all made up and fake and that no one had a story to tell. So, not going to make your mind for you, but take the evidence as it is and tell me what you think. The Conjuring 3. The devil made me do it. Our story begins in the summer of 1979, Brookfield, Connecticut. Deborah Glatzel, her little brother David, and her boyfriend Arnie Johnson are cleaning up a prospective rental home at the edge of the sleepy town when something strange begins to happen to 11-year-old David. Not long after stepping into the rental home, David begins to see strange visions of an old, horribly burned man telling him not to move into the home. At first, it seemed strange, but harmless to him. But as the days wore on, the man became less and less human. He began to develop big, black eyes, jagged teeth, horns, and hooves, and began to threaten to possess the young boy's body. At this point, the malevolence of the Beast Man, as David called him, was on full display. David would reportedly wake up with unexplained bruises and cuts, scream horrible profanity at his sister, levitate, and just randomly cite passages from the Bible and from Milton's Paradise Lost. Deborah decided that it was clearly a possession and reached out to the Warrens for help. Immediately upon meeting David, Lorraine claimed to have seen a black, misty form next to him as they spoke. According to Ed, he wasn't possessed by a single demon, but by 43 separate ones, all of which David could say the names of. The Warrens then called for an exorcism, but were unable to obtain one in a timely manner, resulting in them performing 3 separate, smaller exorcisms. Eventually, they were able to perform the sanctioned exorcism, during which Arnie Johnson began to beg for the demon to take him instead of his little buddy. Arnie claims to have gotten his wish. A few days later, after looking deep inside a well on the property, Arnie's behavior seemed to have changed. He began having fits where he would growl and hallucinate. He even claimed that a spirit had caused him to crash his car into a tree. As these changes started with Arnie, other changes happened with the Glatzel family. They had to move out of the home they were fixing up and into a new apartment. Deborah began working at a dog kennel that her new landlord, Alan Bono, had owned. The three of them had a close relationship, with Arnie repeatedly taking time off just to hang out with Debbie and Alan at the kennel. In fact, on February 16th, 1981, Johnson called in sick so he could meet up with them. The three of them, as well as Deborah's 9-year-old cousin Mary and Johnson's sisters Wanda and Janice, went out to lunch, where Bono and Johnson got very drunk. When they arrived back at the kennel, an argument broke out between Johnson and Bono reportedly grabbed Debbie's young cousin Mary. This caused Johnson to start growling like a wild animal. When Bono released Mary, Johnson pulled out a 5-inch pocket knife and stabbed Bono repeatedly in the chest. Johnson then fled the scene and was discovered over 2 miles away and brought into custody. The trial of Arnie Johnson, however, was the main spectacle in the eyes of the media. Arnie's lawyer, Martin Manella, attempted to submit a not guilty plea on the grounds of demonic possession, dropping what is honestly a quite cold line. The courts have dealt with the existence of God. Now they're going to have to deal with the existence of the devil. Judge Robert Callahan must have had a space heater ready, because his plea was immediately thrown out, with him stating that it would be irrelevant and unscientific, despite the fact that the jury was not allowed to use demon possession claims in deliberation. Manella still had Ed and Lorraine Warren testify that Arnie was possessed. The jury returned a guilty verdict, and Johnson was convicted of first-degree manslaughter with a 10 to 20-year sentence. He would only serve 5 due to good behavior, and is now living in Brookfield with his now wife, Debbie. So what is wrong with this story? Arnie and Debbie were... That's right, they were in financial trouble. You guys are so smart. To begin with, all of the stuff that I said, aside from the supernatural stuff, happened. David was acting strange at some point and they didn't know how to explain it. Arnie stabbed a dude to death. That all happened. That is factual. Again, we're here to talk about whether or not the most parsimonious explanation for all of this is demons existing. So, little details don't really seem to make sense. Like, for example, Ed was claiming that David was possessed by a bunch of different entities, but they were all possessing his body. But for some reason, he also claimed that all of David's toys were possessed and tried to attack him. Again, no one else reported that that had ever happened to anyone. Doesn't really line up with how we're told possessions happen. The person is possessed and can do things that are not normal, not the person and things around them are. Again, maybe my demonology is a little off. Maybe it turns out that, yes, a ghost can do literally everything. It is borderline omnipotent. That could be true, but it just doesn't add up with what I've been taught so far. See, even the judge recognized how ridiculous it would be to just give a dude that murdered somebody a pass just because he claims he was possessed by the devil, because anyone could do that. Like, anyone. So the first person we should look towards is David, and how credible David's possession actually was. That is our first and biggest roadblock, and it's one of the reasons this video is so important. According to David, his father, and his brother, yes, all 3 of them, David was never possessed. The only people that claim that David was possessed is Arnie Johnson and Debbie. It's strange to look at the kid that was possessed, quote unquote, and to say that even though he doesn't think he was possessed, actually he was. And then to look at his dad and his brother that were there the whole time and go, I don't know, I think you guys are stupid too. It comes off as a little bit patronizing to just say this person doesn't know what happened to them. But the reason it's a little more troubling than that is that the brothers, Carl and David Glatzel, ended up filing a lawsuit. and they filed it against Jared Brittle and the Warrens. Jared Brittle being a name you guys need to remember for later. He was another one of those ghost writers like we talked about with Ray Garton earlier. The lawsuit was about the book A Demon in Connecticut, which went over the case of Arnie Johnson and David Glatzel. And as they went to file these lawsuits, the court found that David was extraordinarily mentally ill during the time and was not able to seek treatment. And for reference points for where we were at in mental health at the time, it was the late 70s, 1979 when this started, and PTSD wasn't recognized in the DSM until 1980. So this young child has a mental illness that goes undiagnosed and untreated for the whole time that this is happening. And instead, two people come in and tell him actually he was possessed, and that was the problem. And after the demon leaves him, he's still having these issues. And people don't talk about that part, that he continued to experience mental health issues. So they just abused this young boy and told him that his experiences of his mental illness are just demons inside of him, which probably horrifies that young boy. And then they ignore his mental health until he becomes an adult. Aside from no one being able to prove that anyone was possessed, and the possession likely just being mental illness that was entirely undiagnosed because it was the 70s when it happened, we also have the fact that Carl and David both say that the Warrens claimed they would be millionaires for their story and were paid $2,000, which is about $6,500 in 2022 money, for the rights to this story, which was later turned into a book and then afterwards into a film. And The Conjuring 3 grossed over $200 million. I don't know about you, that seems like a raw deal. Lastly, we have the actual case, which I think is pretty straightforward. Two guys go get drunk. One dude grabs a hold of someone that means a lot to the other dude. The other guy loses his mind and stabs someone. All right. I've seen drunk people stab themselves before. It's not weird to think that someone would stab someone that was trying to harm their family, especially given the fact that they were drunk. No demonic possession needed. But of course, Arnie Johnson and Debbie Glatzel still say that he was possessed, and of course they have every reason to do so, because if he was possessed, then he didn't kill anyone. He's a good guy. He never did anything wrong, and it wasn't his fault that Alan Bono died. And who wouldn't want to stick to that story if it is absolving you of that guilt? And for Debbie, being able to say that your husband isn't a cold-blooded murderer, but is actually just a guy that was taken advantage of, seems better. So, again, everything seems to be pretty straightforward and well explained with normal, natural phenomena, including the fact that, again, they just abused this young boy and forced him to undergo an exorcism when all he needed was some help from a good psychiatrist. So that's pretty heavy. So let's jump right into speed round time. We're going to put some time on the clock and see how many of these we can get done before I decide it's time to go to sleep. So, Annabelle. All of the events of the movie were entirely fabricated with the exception of Ed and Lorraine Warren receiving Annabelle at the beginning of the movie from the two nursing students. However, even that claim and all subsequent claims of Annabelle murking people left and right have only ever been corroborated by Ed and Lorraine Warren. Annabelle also grossed $250 million worldwide, if you were curious. The Nun / Borley Rectory. You don't know what a rectory is? Good for you. Borley Rectory was a house that gained infamy as the most haunted house in England after being described as such by psychic researcher Harry Price. Built in 1862 to the house of rector of the Borley parish and his family, it was badly damaged in a fire in 1939. Ed and Lorraine Warren claimed that it was haunted by a nun that they saw personally, except they couldn't have seen it because it was faked by resident Louis Mayerling and subsequent jokesters at the house. Mayerling even published a book called We Faked the Ghosts of Borley Rectory. Union Cemetery and the White Lady. Union Cemetery is a cemetery located by Stepney Road in Easton, Connecticut, which dates back to the 1700s. According to investigators, there are many spirits that haunt the ground, but the most widely seen apparition is the White Lady. Ed Warren reportedly captured photos of the White Lady during his time investigating the cemetery that were so terrifying that they couldn't release all of them to the public. Except he didn't, because according to his assistant, Judith Penny, who's going to be important later, Ed had dressed her up in a white dress and walked around the cemetery at night in order to get those very photos. So, the South End Werewolf. So the only source I could find on this one that was consistent was the book the Warrens wrote about it, and I'm not going to buy it for this video, so I guess werewolves are real. The Conjuring. In 1971, the Perrin family moved into a 14-room farmhouse known as the Arnold Estate in Harrisville, Rhode Island. After getting settled in, the family began to notice small things that didn't seem quite right. Mother Carolyn noticed that the broom would seem to move from place to place by itself, and sometimes she'd see little dirt piles in the kitchen after she had cleaned it. But slowly, things became more menacing. They reported seeing spirits that smelled like rotting flesh and could cause beds to rise off the floor. They even claimed that some of the spirits would try to possess Carolyn. Eventually, they began being menaced by the antagonist portrayed in the movie, Bathsheba Sherman. Though they did not know her name yet, Sherman's ghost apparently had been committing heinous acts of violence against Carolyn. Most texts on the subject claim that this is when the family reached out to the Warrens, but according to the Perrins, a family friend went to see them while they were giving a lecture and mentioned their predicament to the Warrens. The Warrens then came to the Perrin estate to investigate. During their time in the Perrin home, both the family and the Warrens uncovered macabre mysteries surrounding the property. Carolyn apparently found that the home was owned by the Arnold family for at least 8 generations, and the Warrens discovered that one of the members of the Arnold lineage was the suspected witch and Satanist Bathsheba Sherman. According to the legends, Bathsheba was a witch who sacrificed her children to Satan. She even allegedly murdered a neighbor's child by pushing a sewing needle through the child's skull while she was supposed to be babysitting. Succumbing to her wickedness, she hanged herself from a tree in the backyard after swearing her loyalty to Satan. She then used her non-corporeal form to possess others who lived in the estate and force them to do the same to their children. So what's wrong with this story? Ugh. The Perrin family was in financial trouble. So again, never goes away. Financial troubles are forever prevalent, so that's our first piece. But this specific case goes very deep, which is why I wanted to save it for last. Why you saw The Conjurings 2 and 3 before you saw the first one. The reason for that is because the antagonist, Bathsheba Sherman, is the centerpiece around both the movie's controversy and the real-life controversy surrounding it. Bathsheba wasn't an Arnold. She was the daughter of the Thayer family and the Taft family before she met and married her husband, Judson. According to records that I was able to dig up of the area, the owners of the local farms were the Sherman family, the Arnolds, the Tafts, the Mowrys, the Germains, and Aldrich. So not only was she not an Arnold, Bathsheba never worked on the Arnold farm. She apparently may have never even stepped foot on it. She also never babysat the child that died that allegedly had the pin pushed into her head. That's something that was entirely made up by locals and has never been found in the records that she had anything to do with a child dying. And there's no record of her ever being near a child that died by having a needle pushed through their skull. She did, however, have 3 children that died early on in their lives. But this was the 1800s, so everybody had children that died young. But the key to this is that she had one kid named Herbert that lived longer than she did. So if she was out here just having babies and then murdering them, sacrificing them to Satan, why would she have had a child, kept it alive, and then died first? That doesn't seem quite right. She's supposed to be sacrificing it. The idea that she killed herself by hanging herself in the backyard from a tree while screaming how much she loves Satan also doesn't make any sense, because records show that she died of a stroke at the age of 73. So unless, I don't know, she at 73 years old was able to hang herself from a tree, she like kind of broke her neck, that caused her to fall down and then have a stroke. I doubt anything like that ever happened. So that one's out. No deaths had ever occurred at the Arnold estate, despite us hearing about all of the victims of these grisly murders that happened in the home. Not a single person died there. And in fact, Prudence Arnold, who Lorraine claims was murdered in the Arnold house, was actually murdered, but she was murdered in the Richardson house down the road, not in the house that's claimed to be haunted in the movie and in the book. All of that being said, the small town of Burryville, where this all took place, is an extraordinarily religious town. The average US town has one church for every 800 people. However, Burryville had 6 churches at the time and less than 2,000 people in it, which comes out to be about one church per 300 people, almost 3 times more churches per person than the average in the US, which is already an extraordinarily religious country. So follow me on this one. Would a heavily religious church-going town be willing to put a woman who sacrificed her children to Satan in the ground right next to the children she supposedly murdered and sacrificed to Satan? To assume that religiously minded people would be willing to put a satanic child killer next to her victims when they die doesn't seem to make much sense. So the reason I brought this one up last, and you might be kind of curious because it doesn't seem particularly worse than the other ones. According to a local investigator named Jamie Rubio, who has a blog spot that's linked in the sources down in the description, Bathsheba Sherman has had her grave consistently damaged over the years. People believe that she is a demon-worshipping satanic witch, and they believe it with such fervor that they have gone and destroyed her headstone and urinated on it. These movies have caused legitimate damage to the property of those who have been slandered. These stories, whether we think they're ridiculous fictions or not, somebody out there takes them seriously. By allowing Ed and Lorraine Warren to take the stories of people that have had legitimate hard times put on them and turn them and warp them into these horror stories, we not only ruin the legacy of the people that existed in the area, but we twist the people that are currently alive into doing things that rational people wouldn't be able to justify. And that's my problem with the entire Ed and Lorraine Warren extended universe. It's just a bunch of innocent people being taken advantage of by some nasty, evil grifters that are out to make a buck. Consistently, that's what we see. 2 grifters come up to them and say, hey, guess what? I can make you millions of dollars. All you have to do is lie about your family having some sort of supernatural experience. And if you do that, I can make you more money than you would ever need. If someone came to my house when I was struggling and said, hey, I'm going to write a book about you, make up a bunch of stuff, I'll give you a bunch of money, it would honestly be really hard for me not to do it. I think all of us can sympathize with that, and that is horrifying. That's the true terror of Ed and Lorraine Warren. But even though we have discovered the real danger behind Ed and Lorraine Warren and their escapades, there's actually something even deeper. And before I go into it, I want to put all my jokes and pretenses aside. I've been trying to keep it light throughout this video, because if you've made it this far, you probably don't take most of the things we've talked about too seriously. But the events I'm about to share with you now are to be taken deadly seriously. So if you're the type of person that needs a content warning, this might be your exit. So our last story begins in a sleepy Connecticut town with a city bus driver named Ed and a young 15-year-old girl named Judy. Before Ed and Lorraine Warren became big-time ghost hunters, they didn't have a lot of ways to make ends meet. They both actually intended to be painters, which is pretty interesting, all things considered. And it's how they began getting into doing the paranormal investigations. They would show up, Ed would paint the house, they would offer to give the family the painting if they wanted it, and then they would talk to them. Eventually, by doing this, they were able to build enough rapport with people around them that they started doing it as a full-time job. So while they were doing the artwork, they needed a supplemental income because they couldn't afford their lifestyle given only what they would get in donations from these people. So during that time, Ed Warren decided that he was going to drive the local city bus. Ed Warren begins his journey driving the city bus. After he gets off work, he'd go paint a house, show him a picture, see if he could get inside the house and talk with the owner, and that was his consistent schedule until he met a young girl. This young girl was named Judith Penny. Judith Penny was a girl going to school at the time in the area, and because of where she lived, she ended up riding the city bus instead of the school bus. Ed would pick her up regularly to take her to school and regularly to drop her back off. Eventually, they started building a bit of a rapport. At one point, this rapport went a little too far. According to Penny, they began what she called an amorous relationship. After this began, Judy was invited to live in the Warren house in 1963 and act as Ed and Lorraine Warren's personal assistant. Eventually, they decided to give her an apartment right upstairs from them. According to her, Ed would spend a night downstairs with Lorraine and then a night upstairs with Penny, and then back down and then back up. With a young girl apparently running around very intimately with an older man, people seemed to take notice. And eventually, someone notified the police that something was happening. Penny was arrested, actually, and taken into the North End prison in Bridgeport, where police tried to persuade her to sign a statement admitting to that affair. But she knew that if she did, Ed would be in trouble. So she didn't. She was ordered by court to report to a delinquent youth office for the next month. And can you guess who it was that drove her there every single week? So in a 2014 sworn statement, she says that in 1978, when she was 30, Ed had impregnated her. Ed and Lorraine Warren, being a nice Catholic married couple, couldn't have a mistress with a baby, so they had to do something about it. According to Penny, this is what they told her. Quote, "They wanted me to tell everyone that someone had come into my apartment and raped me, and I wouldn't do that. I was so scared. I didn't know what to do, but I had an abortion. The night they picked me up from the hospital after having it, they went out and lectured and left me alone." Now, I don't know about you, but that's pretty horrifying. This man grooms you when you're a 15-year-old, gives you an apartment upstairs, gives you a baby, forces you to abort it, and then leaves you alone to deal with that the night that it happens. That's a horror that none of the stories that we've heard so far can even come close to. In 2003, just 3 years before the passing of Ed Warren, the relationship between Ed and Penny soured. And when it did, Penny finally moved on and got married. So that's the story. According to Judith Penny, who's now in her 70s, when she was a very young child, she was groomed by Ed and Lorraine Warren to living in their house and almost having Ed's child, eventually forced to have an abortion and never recovering from the trauma that she suffered. Still thinking of Ed as a kind-hearted man to this day. So again, this is all in a 2014 sworn statement that she signed as true. At any time, someone could try and testify against the validity of the statements, but it hasn't happened yet. So, what's wrong with this story? According to Lorraine Warren's legal team, as well as her children, claim that all of this is entirely false. They maintain that Penny is being manipulated to give a false record against her, Warner Brothers, and New Line Cinema, the people that own the extended Ed and Lorraine Warren universe. So who would be manipulating Mrs. Penny to give a false testimony? Well, insert producer Tony DeRosa Grund. Tony DeRosa Grund was the lead producer on the first Conjuring film. When the sequels were announced, and he wasn't the one that was producing them, he decided to launch a series of lawsuits against Warner and New Line, claiming that those were his property, essentially. That he had the right to produce them and that no one else did because they were part of his design. Tony apparently spoke with the former author that worked for the Warrens. If you remember, I said he'd be important. Gerald Brittle, whose biggest book was The Demonologist, which was hugely important for researching this video. He convinced Gerald Brittle that he also had a right to sue New Line and Warner Brothers. So these lawsuits were not only from Tony DeRosa Grund, but also from Gerald Brittle. According to some sources, sworn testimony that Judith Penny gave in 2014 was going to be used in Gerald Brittle's suits against New Line. Eventually, even Gerald Brittle redacted his lawsuit, saying that it was frivolous and silly and that he was only egged on by DeRosa Grund. So Tony DeRosa Grund manipulated Brittle into giving a testimony that he would later back out of, and apparently had manipulated Judith Penny into giving a testimony that she also likely would have backed out of. Also, he could make a quick buck off a series that he actually had no legitimate intellectual property rights on. So lastly on this one, I'm going to leave you with what Judy and Tony Spira have to say about the situation. Judy Spira being the Warrens' daughter, and Tony being her husband. According to them, they never saw any of the alleged abuse during the decades they had spent with Ed, Lorraine, and Penny. They said that my mother and father opened their home to Mrs. Penny. She was 18 and had nowhere else to live, following a childhood of neglect. So, apparently, Judith Penny was a young girl who was troubled with a troubled childhood. When she turned 18, Ed and Lorraine Warren took her in, gave her a job as an assistant to the world-renowned demonologists, took care of her, gave her a home, and in their dying days were told that they were apparently repeated abusers. Miss Penny is now on her own, living somewhere with her now husband, and is talked to by these rich Hollywood producers and told that she can make some money if she just signs a statement saying there was some level of impropriety on the parts of Ed and Lorraine Warren. So, she does. But what's wrong with that story? Yeah, you guys thought I was going to be taken up for Ed and Lorraine Warren, didn't you? Haha, no. As much as I would love for this young woman to have not been abused by Ed and Lorraine Warren, it does seem that the opposite is true, and that her initial statements still hold validity. Settlement was proposed between New Line Warner Brothers and DeRosa Grund and Brittle that would have settled everything, and it would have given Penny $150,000 for the rights to her life and not disclosing her relationship with the Warrens. But that deal never happened, partially because Judy never signed it. She didn't care. In fact, in her statement, she talks about how she still cares about Ed and doesn't see anything wrong with the relationship they had, except for the abortion. Ed and Lorraine Warren's daughter, who, as we said, is also named Judy, which is super weird, claims that she and her husband never saw any of the alleged abuse. However, she herself admits that she was never around during the time that all of the abuse would have been happening. In a Travel Channel interview, she was asked, "So, what were the cases that they talked about around the dinner table?" Her response was, quote, "Well, first of all, I lived with my grandparents because they traveled so much and I had to go to school. I lived with them briefly. I was terrified there in their house, so I just didn't sleep there. I couldn't sleep in a room by myself, and I was young. I was very young. The one case that I was older that they were talking about the most was the Devil in Connecticut case." End quote. So according to her, she lived with her grandparents and spent very little time around the Warrens. If that's the case, how do you have any right to claim that you never saw any of the alleged abuse? You weren't there for it. Clearly, in this case, the issue is that Judy and Tony now are in charge of the Warrens Museum and their legacy. They're the ones that are handling everything. And if your father turns out to have been a pedophile the whole time, you're probably not going to make as much money. So, the last piece of evidence I want to present to you is that Ed happened to pass away before the Conjuring movie series began, so Lorraine was given reins on everything inside of the movies. She decided that in order for them to get the licensing to use their stories, she would have what is, according to film talent agent Jill Smith, who's been an expert in the field for the past 35 years, an unheard of stipulation for any contract. And that stipulation is that neither her nor her husband could be seen engaging in crimes, including sex with minors, child pornography, prostitution, or sexual assault, and that neither the husband nor wife could be depicted as participating in extramarital sexual relationships. That, to me, is, again, the true damage that the Warrens produce. Before they passed, they had become a very powerful couple. This power and influence that they had was able to cause people, as we spoke earlier, to destroy someone's gravestone. And in this case, they were almost entirely successful in covering up their sexual improprieties. And with the knowledge that Ed weaseled his way into grooming a young child, I want to leave you with a quote that came apparently directly from Ed Warren's mouth, except this case it's going to be relayed from Patrick Wilson playing Ed in the movie. In this quote, Ed explains the stages of a demonic possession. And I just want you to notice the eerie parallels between what Ed describes as the stages of demonic possession and what Ed had done as the stages of grooming a child.
Which brings us to the 3 stages of demonic activity: infestation, oppression, and possession. Now, infestation, that's the whispering, the footsteps, the feeling of another presence, which ultimately grows into oppression. The second stage. Now, this is where the victim, and it's usually the one who's the most psychologically vulnerable, is targeted specifically by an external force. Breaks the victim down, crushes their will, and once in a weakened state, leads them to the third and final stage, possession.
Whew, all right. So that was a rough one, right? Oh, God. So that's a tough video to get through there at the end. It got real harsh. So I'm going to leave you with something to laugh at. Felt a slap on his face. Face on his face. It's time. Oh, yes, it's time. The priest came in. He decided that he wasn't having none of it because apparently some dude just slapped him in his little face. What's wrong with this one, huh? What's wrong with this story? What the fuck is it? What the fuck is wrong with these fucking stories? It's time to do them all. Oh, God damn it, Janet. What's these ghosties, you know, these wiggly bigglies, you know, they fuck you up. Doubling as a rapper. Little spook. Oh, no, that's racist. Yeah. Big brain time. The Warrens talked about how Undertaker used to fuck the bodies. Mellow Yellow. I'm sponsored by them. I'm not sponsored by Mellow Yellow. That's a lie. I was joking. They did it again. And then again. They kept doing it in January 1986. This is Groundhog Day, but for horrifying occurrences. Is somebody beating their kids outside right now? What the fuck? The Undertaker. Yeah, the guy, the wrestling guy. The haunting in Connecticut. A stove catches fire and that's your evidence. Like, yeah. They do that sometimes. The wrestling guy used to fuck the bodies. Oh my god, the ghosts. It's the ghosts.